Aren't we all glad that we are healthy enough to be able to listen to the annual meeting program? Yes, we don't want to take it for granted. Worldwide, some 20,000 of our brothers and sisters died so far from the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic. But tens of thousands of our brothers and sisters, including many relatives, have been and are now affected emotionally by this fact. Death's toll affects friends and family, and the feeling of loss is deep. Secular sources say that the overall death rate in the United States is about 1% of the population each year. Every year around the world, an average of over 60 million people die. The daily average is about 164,000. How sad. With the COVID-19 plague, the number of total deaths worldwide is of course higher. In the United States, over 600,000 citizens died from COVID-19 alone. Even when tempered by the hope of the resurrection, the death of a loved one is still a traumatic loss which is deeply felt. Years, perhaps decades, of close companionship and sharing are suddenly and tragically ended. Of course, if those that died were part of our family, it affects you much more emotionally. We are also affected because we did not expect them to die, except perhaps if some were in their 80s or 90s. Even though you know that they will come back, you still feel hurt and are very sorry to have temporarily lost them.
So we're watching Gerrit Lösch delivering the talk, "No Resident Will Say I Am Sick." I'm not sure I need to comment too much on this. This is a brilliant example of a governing body member talking on a horrendous subject and apparently being completely disengaged and almost indifferent, at least in terms of body language, regarding what he's saying. He's talking about death. He's talking about tragedy. He's talking about grief, about millions of people dying each year. 9 million out of that 60 million figure he gave each year are children dying in the millions on a yearly basis. Death, tragedy, suffering, and his body language is completely disconnected. I don't understand how it's helpful for the organization to be putting this sort of material out there. If I were a Jehovah's Witness watching this, I'd be thinking, the guy doesn't care. The guy just doesn't care about what he's chosen to talk about, which is death and grief. And Gerrit Lösch, being one of the most senior members on the governing body, in fact, he is the most senior member in terms of how long he's been serving, a man of his age will surely have gone through a lot of bereavement, will surely have seen a lot of his family and loved ones and friends die over the decades. And he's just not showing any sort of emotion regarding what he's talking about. And as we're going to see later on in my full rebuttal, this is a guy who doesn't struggle to show emotion on camera in other areas and when talking about other subjects. But when it comes to talking about actual death, in the context of a pandemic, when, as we've heard, 20,000 Jehovah's Witnesses have died, this for me is just a bizarre and unfortunate spectacle for Jehovah's Witnesses to be seeing at their annual meeting.
Jehovah foretold that sickness and death will not continue forever, but are temporary now and will soon end as the new world arrives. Even in the past, Jehovah miraculously proved that he is able to prevent sickness and subsequent death. And he proved that he has the power to bring back humans to life. As much as we are sorry to have lost relatives and or friends in death due to COVID-19 or any other reason, we can rejoice that Jehovah will bring them back in the resurrection. Jehovah brought back some of his servants in a resurrection in the past. The Bible speaks of 9 specific resurrections of individuals. The future resurrection is better because it contains the possibility to never die again in all eternity. Imagine to live not only for 1,000 years, but for 1,000,000 years, for 10 million years, for 100 million years, for 100 billion years, and so on.
Yes, just imagine that. Just imagine living for 100 billion years, and so on. Actually, I can't imagine it, and I don't think I ever could imagine it. That's one of the funny things about life, is it kind of gets its meaning from how transient it is, and how you don't just have infinite opportunities to do absolutely anything or go absolutely anywhere. You have your few decades on this planet, if you're lucky. Again, 9 million children a year don't even get decades. You have your moment on this rock, and then you're done. And that gives life, at least from my perspective, that gives life some sense of preciousness. It's something that's rare and finite, and trying to imagine being on Earth for over 100 billion, 200 billion, 300 billion, 1,000,000,000,000 years, and so on. I just can't imagine it. It would, dare I say it, at some point it's going to get boring. We need to have an end, I think. And granted, probably 70 or 80 years is too little. If I had my way, I'd like it to be more than that. I'd like it to be... I could conceivably imagine living for 100, 200, 300 years and getting some enjoyment from life. But that would be probably the absolute limit in my mind. I could just about get my head around 300 years. But by that time, I'd be like, I'm bored. When does this thing end? 100 billion? 200 billion? 1,000,000,000,000? No, I cannot imagine it, Gerrit Lösch. And what I especially can't imagine is spending all of that time on a paradise Earth under the rulership of Gerrit Lösch, under the rulership of God's kingdom, and having to spend all eternity praising the monster who's killed 8 billion people. I especially couldn't imagine that. It's hard enough for me to imagine 300 years of life on a normal planet Earth, but having to imagine eons of time, just ridiculous spans of time, living in that sort of dystopia where morning, noon and night I have to praise this genocidal maniac for killing all of those children and killing all of those billions of non-Jehovah's Witnesses. I especially can't imagine that. And yet, how did Gerrit Lösch just describe the resurrection hope?
Jehovah foretold that sickness and death will not continue forever, but are temporary now and will soon end as the new world arrives.
Yes, death will soon end when the new world arrives. The new world arriving just after Armageddon, when there will have been more death, more carnage, more bloodshed than the planet will ever have seen ever. That's going to fix the problem of sickness and death. In order to fix the problem of sickness and death, we need more death than has ever been seen in the history of our planet. We need to see 8 billion non-Jehovah's Witnesses all slaughtered. That's going to be our solution to the problem of sickness and death. And then you have Gerrit Lösch appealing to this sick promise, this depraved carrot on a stick charlatanry, whereby Jehovah's Witnesses are induced to fall under his control and to acknowledge his authority with the promise that by doing so, they'll see their loved ones again.
As much as we are sorry to have lost relatives and or friends in death due to COVID-19 or any other reason, we can rejoice that Jehovah will bring them back in the resurrection.
It's bad enough dealing with grief. It's bad enough dealing with the tragic loss of a loved one, a brother, a sister, a father, a mother, a husband, a wife. It's bad enough going through that. But to have that loss, to have that misery and heartache exploited and capitalized upon by a cheap huckster like Gerrit Lösch and his associates, saying, oh, we've got the solution here. We know you're crying. We know you're in anguish because you've just lost someone, say, due to COVID-19. We know you're going through absolute hell and torment over no longer having this cherished, treasured person in your life. But don't worry, we're the solution. We are your avenue for seeing them again in the future. If you just follow us, if you just allow us to control your life and micromanage even your medical decisions and what you wear and whether you go through higher education or not, guess what? We'll arrange it so you can be reunited. This is one of the sickest things about this religion, and there are many things. As viewers of this channel will know, there are many things that I criticize Jehovah's Witnesses about. But for me personally, well, this is a personal issue for me because this particular false promise, this particular lie, I believe, kept me in the organization for longer than I otherwise would have stayed in the organization. I lost my mother at 21. I had already started having doubts before then, but I stayed in the organization because I had been manipulated by Gerrit Lösch and others into thinking that my mother wasn't quite dead. She was still alive in Jehovah's memory, and the way for me to see her again was to allow the governing body to control my life, to give years and decades of service to the organization, and in return, I would be reunited with my mother. It's one of the sickest things this religion does, and in this talk, Gerrit Lösch is celebrating it.